Welcome, everybody. This is a public lecture presented by Dr. Rodolfo, our colleague in the Department of Psychology, who's going to speak for about 5 minutes, yes, on multisystemic resilience framework for conflict-affected societies. And this lecture is part of his promotion. So once Alexander finishes his lecture, we're going to have to ask the audience if they have any questions for the speaker, and then we're going to ask the audience to leave the room and the online meeting so that the committee can discuss with Alexandros and interview him as part of this process. So we're ready to start. I hope everybody can hear us. And Alexandros, the floor is yours.
Maybe I don't need to be host. Okay, thank you very much, Honorable Evaluation Committee, Professor Panagiotou, Professor Konstantinidou, Dr. Karianaki, Professor Schweitz, Professor Papadopoulos. I am honored that you have taken all the time to review my academic work so far, and that you are present here today for this lecture. I am also honored and glad to see so many friends, physically and online, and colleagues from students and people from different universities and practitioner colleagues who have joined in today to attend this lecture. So I will talk about developing a multisystemic resilience framework for conflict-affected societies. This is something that I and colleagues have been working on for several years now in different countries. And this lecture is an attempt to gather together much of the work that has been done into one cohesive framework. And but let us first start. Let us first start by reflecting a bit on this phenomenon of violent conflict. It's much more than we read in the news. According to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the chart that I'm showing here, we have more than, if you add up the state-based, non-state violence and one-sided violence, we have more than 150 active violent conflicts around the world. The number has been growing, especially since 2010. It's a matter of speculation why global conflict has been on the increase. On the top chart, which is from the Council of Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker, you can see the global prevalence of conflict. You can see that it's in every continent. It's everywhere in the world. It's in the Middle East, it's in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, of course in Ukraine, of course nearby here in Syria. So it's a matter that we can easily ignore in our going about our day-to-day lives and being cocooned in the safety that we might personally be experiencing. There are many violent conflicts. It's not just one thing. We can consider a typology of violent conflict, if you like. It's a macabre typology. It's not a pleasant typology. We can talk about interstate wars versus civil wars, and interstate wars can be two-sided. They can be an invasion occupation process. It can be a war of liberation even. We can talk about civil wars. They can take a characteristic of a secessionist conflict. They can be an ethnic conflict where the main dividing factor is ethno-cultural background. There can be a resource-based conflict where it's about survival, it's about physical survival, and we can have genocide. And this is not a comprehensive list of the different types of conflict. And of course, what all types of conflict have in common is the loss of human life, the total disruption of daily life, and the trauma that ensues. By the way, I have some copies here of the slides for the committee members. If I may leave them over here, just for the. So, what are the consequences of violent conflict? Human casualties, substantial loss of life and injuries sustained by civilians and combatants during violent conflicts, forced displacement of populations that might include internally displaced persons, as well as refugees who are fleeing the violence and the insecurity. Disruption of economic infrastructure, disruption of trade and investment, loss of jobs and income, resulting in economic stagnation or decline that sometimes can last for generations. Social disintegration, weakening of social ties and trust, the erosion of social norms and values, as communities are torn apart by violence and displacement. Psychological trauma, which is experienced by individuals directly or indirectly affected by the conflict, resulting in mental health issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder and various other comorbidities. Human rights abuses that are perpetrated by armed groups or state actors, including torture, sexual violence, and forced recruitment of child soldiers. Food insecurity and famine, disruption of food production and distribution systems, resulting in food insecurity, and in extreme cases, especially with prolonged chronic conflict, famine. And to top it all off, state fragility, weakening of state institutions and the rule of law, resulting in increased corruption, political instability, and the potential for renewed conflict. And of course, a fragile state is the last thing you need when you are dealing with all of these problems. And while violent conflict is a very serious and challenging problem, there are great research and practice gaps in addressing it. And what I'm presenting here is I think it's a consensus of what I've been hearing when I'm talking to practitioners, when I'm talking to other scholars that are working on this field. A major problem is siloed approaches. Humanitarian actors do not understand development. Peace builders do not understand mental health. Mental health practitioners do not understand peace building. And yet the people who are suffering are one and the same, and they have all of these needs. And you have all of these sectors trying to help them in an incoherent way. Difficulty in measuring critical indicators, especially on soft matters such as mental health or readiness for peace. You can measure how many schools are there, how many roads have been built, but how can you measure how peaceful someone is? How can you measure to what extent the whole population is suffering psychologically? As clinical psychologists, it's quite challenging for us to measure just one person when we're doing a clinical assessment. Imagine having to understand a whole population. Mismatch of solutions to cultural contexts. We have very often one size fits all solutions that are generated by the UN or by Western universities that are propagated throughout the world without necessarily being a good fit. Difficulty in evaluating the impact of interventions because of the chaos in which these interventions are taking place, but also because of the measurement issues that I mentioned above. Inability to agree on long-term strategies for systemic transformation. Different stakeholders have widely different perspectives on what should be done. And even though everyone would like to see the end of bloodshed and restoration of mental health and other such good things, very often stakeholders become paralyzed in disagreements. And as a result of all this, conflict systems tend to self-perpetuate, resist intervention, and become chronic. That's the reality that we are all facing, that the scholars and practitioners that are involved in the wider field are facing. I have been involved in this whole field of peace building and mental health for some years now, even before joining academia. So from 2011 to 2018, I was providing what I think I can describe as peace building advisory services to the UN and other international organizations. And as part of that, we developed the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index, the SCORE, as an interdisciplinary research toolkit to identify cross-sectoral needs of conflict-affected societies. We tried to address some of these measurement problems that I mentioned before, and also some of those siloing issues. We collaborated with various international organizations to implement the score in more than 12 conflict-affected countries across Africa, Asia, and Europe. And during that same period, I was completing my doctorate in clinical psychology, graduated in 2016. Since joining academia 4 years ago, I have been focusing my work on a smaller number of countries and programs, primarily Ukraine, South Sudan, and Rwanda. Of course, the Center for Sustainable Peace and Democratic Development is still ongoing. It still does work in many, many more countries. But as an academic, of course, I needed to focus my own work to more explicitly develop the theoretical and empirical foundations on how we integrate peace building with mental health. And the framework that I've been reflecting within is a framework of multisystemic resilience, as I will discuss in a moment. Gradually, I have found myself recentering my attention from multisystemic assessment to cross-sectoral intervention in conflict-affected societies. I think I'm at that stage in my life as an academic and as a person where I am no longer satisfied just to understand what the problem is, but also want to contribute in finding some solutions to make life better for people that are suffering due to conflict. In this presentation, I will outline the theoretical framework for multisystemic resilience of conflict-affected societies that I and colleagues have been developing over the past several years, present relevant research projects and findings, especially from these 3 countries, and reflect on lessons learned and outline some future directions. Let's first try to understand societies as a system. We can think of societies as human societies as multi-level phenomena that are comprised of individuals, families, communities, and institutions. And of course, social ecological thinking dictates, and that's something that we psychologists have been reflecting a lot on in the last several decades. And according to Grothendieck's model, we think that what happens at the level of individuals is affected by what happens at the level of families, at the level of communities, at the level of institutions. So if we have supportive and empowering families, that leads to responsive, adaptive, connected, and healthy individuals. The outcome will be even better if you have cohesive and sustainably growing communities. And of course, all of these things are enabled by effective and service-oriented institutions. And we psychologists and other social scientists understand this quite well. But where the integration with peace building comes in is in looking at the opposite flow, from the individual to the society. Because very often we psychologists, and especially clinical psychologists, our interest tends to end once we make the person feel better, experience well-being, and that's where we feel that our little silo has ended. But then that's where peace building comes in, and peace builders think, okay, how can individuals become agents of peace in their community? How can they contribute? How can they transform infrastructure? How can they transform communal relations? So we have both. So social systems have this from top to bottom, and also from bottom to top characteristics. And this looks good, doesn't it? I mean, this looks like this is healthy. Yeah, this is what a healthy society should look like. What happens with violent conflict is that it affects all of these levels. Yeah, so at violent conflict, I'm not going to discuss in this lecture what causes violent conflict. It's not in the scope of the presentation. But when violent conflict does happen at the individual level, it leads, and we know this from a lot of empirical studies, it leads to trauma, aggression, identity disturbance, loss of purpose, loss of skills. Not all of these things to every single person, and not everyone is affected. Some people are resilient against these effects, but the prevalence of all of these increases in societies. We have displacement at the level of families. We have families becoming displaced or separated due to death, for instance, of a family member, or because they were separated in the displacement process. We have poverty. We also have increased incidence of family abuse. And I will actually show you some data that is related to this from one of our studies. At the level of communities, intergroup stereotypes and hostilities increase. And as for institutions, they tend to become under-resourced, because who has time to manage institutions in a time of war? And they also tend to become marginalizing, because as societies become more polarized, institutions also become more exclusive and, for instance, start to serve only one ethnic group and not the other. These things happen everywhere in the world. And unfortunately, what was before a virtuous circle of social cohesion, of multi-level cohesion, becomes a vicious circle where the fragmentation of each level is affecting subsequent levels. So, for instance, the challenges of families under these circumstances means that young people are not protected as much. And those young people who were not protected because they grew up in conflict, when they grow up and try to lead institutions, they cannot lead them properly. Yeah? So you have all of these multi-level vicious effects that make violent conflict become what is often termed in political science a wicked problem. Yeah? And political scientists define wicked problems as problems that are so complex and multisystemic that even if you try to do something at one level, it will be overrun, it will be overcome by the wider dysfunction. So what can we do? What I will discuss in this lecture, and the model that we have been developing with colleagues, is a model of multisystemic societal healing that includes components of mental health, peace building, and livelihoods. And through multisystemic societal healing, all of these levels can be and should be targeted at the same time. We have seen this done. This is not my discovery. I have seen this done very well by others. And I did not come here today to say my own ideas. I came here today to say what I have witnessed. I have seen society communities, for instance, in South Sudan, becoming totally transformed from the top to the bottom because enough efforts were focused on a single village over several months or years, and to get that village to support recovery at all of those levels. So when you invest all these efforts, you have recovering and resilient individuals gradually restoring their mental health, acquiring new skills, regaining their sense of purpose, recovering and resilient families that can interrupt intergenerational trauma and restore relationships, recovering and resilient communities that are gradually rebuilding trust, redeveloping the local economy, recovering and resilient institutions, gradually regaining effectiveness, sense of mission, and organizational capacities. And the bottom line of all that, as well as regaining that sense of virtuous circle, is that conflict and violence is reduced. So that's the overall theoretical framework on which has been the result of a lot of this work, but also on which this work is based. And of course, based on this framework, several research questions become apparent. Because it's a good idea in general, but what does it mean specifically for specific countries? And how can we use this framework to really understand what's happening and really come up with better solutions? The first research question is, how precisely does violent conflict impact individuals, families, communities, and institutions? This is an empirical question, which requires empirical research, and it can inform protection efforts. The second question is, through which strategies and capacities is recovery and resilience already taking place in conflict-affected societies? This is another empirical question that requires us to really find good ways to observe how societies are adapting after conflict. And finally, what additional interventions could be developed to facilitate the recovery and resilience of conflict-affected societies? So this is not a population research question. This is an intervention science question. Yeah, considering what is already happening in a society, what more can we do, and how can we test if it's effective? And what I will do is I will present some research findings related to each of these three questions. I will focus on projects in the three countries that I mentioned already. What we did in Ukraine, together with colleagues, was to investigate the adaptation of conflict-exposed adolescents through school-based research, and also investigated the systemic resilience of Ukrainian schools. But I will talk about the first one. Of course, there has been a lot more research that I and colleagues conducted in Ukraine, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will only focus on the collaborations that we had with UNICEF. In South Sudan, we investigated entry points for resilience through multi-level community research. We used the methodology of multi-level surveys where we are simultaneously assessing individuals within their households, but also assessing communities as a whole, and then combining the two levels of data to generate insight. And Rwanda, where we have been conducting population research to assess needs and survivors and perpetrators of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. In Rwanda, as well as doing population research, we have designed and we are currently implementing cross-sectoral interventions, and I will talk about those as well. So, going to the first question, understanding the impact of violent conflict. What can we learn from population research in South Sudan, Ukraine, and Rwanda? What I will present to you for each of these countries, for South Sudan and Ukraine, I will present to you quantitative models, which we developed based on the research findings. But for Rwanda, we'll do something different. I will not present you findings at the individual level. I will quantitative at the individual level. I will present to you qualitative findings at the systemic level, where we used interviews to understand what institutions have been doing to contribute to recovery over the past almost 30 years now. So in South Sudan, we looked at the impact of adversity across multiple systems on mental health, readiness for peace, and food security. I will be happy to answer questions later on about methods and questionnaires and all that. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will just stay focused on presenting results. And if anyone is interested, of course, I'm sure the committee will be interested. Of course, I can talk about more details regarding measures and methods. So what kind of adversities did we look at in the case of South Sudan? We looked at conflict exposure. To what extent a participant has been affected by the civil war that has been taking place in South Sudan since 2013. It actually ended in 2020. Please do not confuse South Sudan with Sudan, where there is active fighting going on now. South Sudan is a different country from Sudan, so it's not related to the current one. Community insecurity is something that we measured at the community level. It was an overall sense of to what extent a community is safe or unsafe to live in, to what extent is there rule of law in the community. We looked at floods and we looked at droughts, which are increasingly prevalent in South Sudan due to climate change. And we looked at livestock disease, which is, of course, a very serious issue in a pastoral country like South Sudan, where people absolutely rely on their livestock for survival. And we looked at three different outcomes: mental health, peacefulness, and food consumption. You see the importance of getting out of silos. Psychologists, if a psychologist did research, they would only look at the mental health outcome. If a peace building practitioner did research, they would only look at the peacefulness outcome. And if a development expert did research, they would only look at the food consumption outcome. That's the kind of, and then they would be designing solutions based on optimizing that one system only. Yeah, that you are now beginning to see the value of adopting a multi-systemic perspective. So what did we find? We found that mental health is affected quite severely by all of these stressors, especially community insecurity and past conflict exposure, but also floods and livestock disease. Peacefulness, interestingly, and consistent with theories about resource conflict, we found it to be primarily affected by floods and droughts, which of course affect livelihood systems. When you have floods and droughts, you don't have enough food, and it seems that I think the implication here is that that causes resource competition and willingness for conflict. And food consumption, we actually measured it using FAO methodology, Food and Agriculture Organization, where you actually do a questionnaire where you ask people, what did you eat this week? Yeah. And you try to work out how many calories they ate by asking what they ate that week. We found that food consumption, of course, is also affected by floods and droughts, but it's also affected by conflict exposure, which shows the link between conflict exposure and destruction of capacities leading to poverty. Yeah. So we're already beginning to get a map of the landscape of how adversity is impacting all of these outcomes. I will now transport you away from South Sudan towards Ukraine, so that we look at the challenge of the impact of conflict and the impact of adversity linked to conflict, not on adults, but on adolescents. In Ukraine, the study we conducted a very large population study with UNICEF, almost 8,000 participants in what was then the conflict-affected areas, which was the east of Ukraine. That was before the current phase of the war, which is now affecting southern Ukraine as well, and the whole of the country. And we looked at 3 different adversities in the lives of young people, in the lives of adolescents. We looked at issues of microsystemic violence, such as family abuse and ineffective parenting. We looked at conflict hardship, so to what extent adolescents were exposed to fighting, to what extent their village was shelled by opposing forces, to what extent they lost a relative in the war. And we looked at socio-demographic adversity, which is basically growing up in poverty. And this is a structural equation model. So it's interesting to see how these predict outcomes that are of interest in adolescents, such as emotional problems, aggressive behaviors, suicidality and self-harm, social hostility and social disengagement. Clinical psychologists typically look at these. Maybe social psychologists and peace builders would be more interested in these outcomes. But what we see is that these adversities affect all of these outcomes. And especially we see that microsystemic violence is the stronger predictor of emotional problems, risk-taking and aggressive behaviors, and suicidality and self-harm. But all of these have an impact on social functioning indicators such as disengagement and hostility. What is really interesting, though, even though it appears that microsystemic violence is the strongest predictor, I invite you to reflect on this correlation here between conflict hardship and microsystemic violence. In social science, we usually say correlation is not causation, but here, you can't really make, there's a limit to what hypothesis you can make, because it's not really a tenable hypothesis to say that microsystemic violence has caused the war. What is a more likely hypothesis is that the war has caused microsystemic violence. And this is a piece of evidence that is added on top of other existing evidence that we know in the literature, that families that are struggling due to, that have been victimized due to war, that kind of pressure and tension sometimes is externalized in intra-family violence. Yeah, we saw that also with COVID, and this is something we see with war. So even though conflict hardship seems to be a weaker predictor of all these things, maybe what is happening here is that conflict hardship is affecting adolescent outcomes, not so much directly, but by affecting or even destroying family systems on which adolescents rely on. Now, let's go to Rwanda to see what we can learn from that piece of the puzzle. We looked in Rwanda at the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder in diverse socio-demographic groups that have been affected by the genocide against the Tutsi. And the first column is, the first and second column are genocide survivors who actually lived through the genocide. that means that they were more than 28 years old when we did the study. The genocide was 29 years ago, and we did this study 2 years ago. So anyone who is any survivor who is more than 28 years old lived through the genocide, either as an infant or a child or an adolescent or a young person. And you see the prevalence of PTSD almost 30 years later is almost 30%. This is consistent with other studies that have been done in Rwanda. And this shows this cyclical nature, this stabilization of the system in a maladaptive trajectory. I mean, this is what you see here. To still have, for 30% of this population, to still have PTSD 30 years later is quite a grave situation. But what is probably more troubling in this slide is when you look at these two columns here. These are youth under 27 from survivor family, and these are youth under 27 who are not from survivor family. The youth under 27 never lived through the genocide. They were born after the genocide. And yet 16% of them also meet criteria for PTSD, as opposed to only 3%, which is a more normal percentage, which might be linked to other factors, in non-survivor families. So there is a 6-fold increased risk of PTSD in children from survivor families. And this is why there is so much talk about intergenerational trauma in countries like Rwanda, and not just Rwanda. In most conflict-affected countries, a lot of the research is now focusing on intergenerational trauma, what it means, why it happens, how does it happen? Is it epigenetic? Is it mediated through parental psychopathology? Is it mediated through maladaptive parenting practices? A lot of it is still conjecture. We still don't have all the answers as to why intergenerational trauma is happening, but we do know that it's happening because we have evidence such as this. It's also interesting to note that these two columns here are the prisoners. We also conducted research in prisons. So you see that current prisoners and former prisoners also have quite high prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, which goes against how we usually understand PTSD as being something that the victim suffers. Yes, here we see the perpetrator being traumatized. Why? Is it moral injury? There's a literature around moral injury. Is it because they have in turn been abused in prison as retribution for the damage that they have caused? But you see here how widespread trauma is in this population. And how about other psychopathology? Using the same data set, we did a psychometric network analysis of mental health symptoms to see how these different symptoms cluster together. And we found that trauma symptoms, of course, they cluster very closely with one another. Each small circle is one questionnaire item. Yeah? So it can be, this can be the hyperarousal symptom. This can be remembering past events. This can be, the depression can be, this item here can be, I've lost interest in my usual activity. So psychometric network analysis is a method that allows you to, that is more nuanced than usual factor analysis in terms of really understanding the relationship between different variables. And what we have found is that trauma is the psychopathology that is most proximal to all other psychopathologies that tend to occur in a circle around it. So on one side of the circle, we have the anxiety disorders over here, and anxiety and depression and suicidality. On the other side of the circle, we have externalizing problems and substance abuse. We have borderline personality, etc. So that's another. Now, I don't know whether something like this would be replicated in a non-conflict country. I would venture to guess that it would not necessarily be replicated. I think, and when I have discussed this finding extensively with colleagues in Rwanda, with academic colleagues at the University of Rwanda, and what everyone seems to converge on as an explanation for this finding is a ripple effect perspective on post-genocide mental distress. So We have at the center exposure to the genocide in 1994. 1 million people dead, 3 million people directly witnessed or were survivors of the genocide. The immediate post-genocide aftermath was very severe post-traumatic stress, especially hyperarousal and re-experiencing symptoms. And gradually over time, unhelpful coping strategies set in, such as avoidance, seeking gratification, and over-control. And these, in time, became co-occurring mental health difficulties, such as that are underpinned by those maladaptive coping strategies to PTSD. So depression, suicidality, OCD, substance use, anxiety, etc. That seems to be the theory that stakeholders that I and other colleagues in Rwanda are converging on based on these findings. So the bottom line is that we now have this, what used to be pure PTSD is now a complex web of comorbidities with underlying PTSD. So some key insights on the impact of violent conflict. The first is that multiple historical, social, and livelihood factors affect mental health in conflict-affected societies. You cannot address mental health only through the health sector. Yeah? You have to look at the social determinants of mental health. That's one of the first insights that one should consider. The second is that exposure is this whole cycle around conflict and food insecurity. Exposure to conflict is associated with food insecurity, while climate-induced resource scarcity is additionally associated with propensity for violent behavior. And now what does this suggest? I think it suggests patterns of cyclical violence that are mediated through breakdown of livelihood systems. Yeah. And as for the mental health and social adaptations of adolescents, it is severely affected by violent conflict, but mostly indirectly through the disruption of family systems. And furthermore, trauma from exposure to violent conflict is transmitted intergenerationally and also tends to become comorbid with various other mental health disorders. So what are we learning so far? The importance of thinking about multiple systems. We cannot address all of these challenges unless we work on the family system, unless we work on livelihood systems, unless we work on the community systems. And also, of course, on the psychological system of each individual. Let's look now at some research that we conducted on where we tried to document existing processes of recovery and resilience. I will again present some findings from Ukraine, from the same data set, but a different publication. I will also present the rest of the South Sudan study, where we focused not so much on the adversity impact, but on the resilience outcomes, on what causes resilience. And on Rwanda, I will be using qualitative methods to identify cross-sectoral community adaptations in the period since the genocide against the Tutsi. What I mentioned before, actually. Yeah. I think I mentioned it prematurely earlier. So, in Ukraine, what we did is that in resilience science, we used two different types of quantitative approaches. One is person-centered analysis, and the other is variable-centered analysis. In person-centered analysis, we form groups of individuals that are more or less resilient, and then we compare those groups to understand their characteristics. In variable-centered analysis, we define resilience as a statistic, and we see what variables predict. So these are the two methods have different uses, and I will show you one example from the one method now, and then another from the other method. So what we did with this data set of Ukrainian adolescents is that we collected data at 2 time points. From the wider sample of 7,800, we had about 2,500 that were on both time points, and we organized through latent profile analysis. We clustered the adolescents at each time point in 3 different groups. Those who displayed high adaptation in terms of peacefulness, but poor mental health, those who displayed poor, low peacefulness but high mental health, and those who managed to somehow combine the two, i.e. they were adolescents that were both peaceful and they also enjoyed psychological well-being, yeah? These are the adolescents that peace builders and psychologists would be happy with, yeah? These are the adolescents that peace builders would have a problem with, but psychologists would be happy with. And these are the adolescents that peace builders would be happy with, but psychologists would be raising a red flag, yeah? Just to give you that interdisciplinary perspective. And we looked at how we used latent transition analysis to see how these groups of adolescents are, whether they're staying stable over time, over a year, or transitioning to another group. And what we found was that the majority remained stable, but there was an interesting, and some actually deteriorated, but there was an interesting group that recovered. It's a relatively small group. It's the two groups in blue here. So they recovered from a problematic situation to a more adaptive situation. So what we did is that we organized the participants into 5 groups, which we then compared against their socio-emotional skills and family functioning. So the first group is one that by the end of the study displayed fragile mental health, only fragile mental health, or primarily fragile mental health. The other was the group that primarily displayed fragile peaceful living. Then we have the small group of delayed recovery that were not doing well at time 1, but recovered by time 2. We had the well-adjusted group that didn't actually experience any adversity, because we used that criterion as well. Talk about resilience, you must first document prior adversity. Otherwise, you talk about good adjustment, you don't talk about resilience. And then finally, we had the resilient group who, even though they experienced significant adversity, stayed at both time points, they displayed high levels of peacefulness and mental health. And in terms of socio-emotional skills, we found that there are significant differences in the profile of adolescents in the 5 groups. The most notable finding is that the adolescents that are in the fragile peaceful living group are the most impaired in terms of psychological, of socio-emotional function. They display lower socio-emotional skills than all other groups. The groups that are, the group that has fragile mental health has selective impairments on issues like expressive communication, self-management, and self-esteem. And then it's probably not very surprising that the resilient group is doing quite well on everything. It does suggest the importance of holistic socio-emotional capacities as a path to resilience. What is quite interesting, though, is the profile of the delayed recovery group, which is struggling on various socio-emotional skills, but are actually doing as well as the resilient and well-adjusted groups in expressing themselves and in tolerating distress, and marginally in cooperation. So this suggests that those recovering adolescents have found a way to be patient through their struggles, even if they are not coping very well, and to reach out for help. So it seems that the skill of reaching out is an important aspect of recovery. And again, this is consistent with other similar studies that have been conducted. Looking at social factors underpinning these 5 groups, we see that that the factor that most differentiates the resilient and the recovering groups from the fragile groups, especially fragile peaceful living group, is family connected. So again, you see, we're cycling back to what we said before about the importance of family cohesion in conflict-affected adolescents. Another characteristic of recovering adolescents is maternal positive parenting and maternal monitoring. So the role of the mother is particularly important in recovery, whereas the whereas adolescents that, as well as having an involved mother, they also have an involved father and involved teachers, those are not in the recovering group, they're in the resilient group. Yes. So they are more fully fortified against all of these negative impact of conflict. Whereas adolescents that have some support from their mother, but have a more absentee father, they are more likely to experience dysfunction in the early period after conflict and then recover gradually. Yeah. So again, the importance of family cohesion, the importance of fathers stepping up and considering their own role. Interestingly, we can think about the connection between the individual variables and the family variables. This is just a very quick analysis that is intended to demonstrate as demonstration more than anything else. And what we see, if we look at the average correlations of the contextual variables versus all the individual characteristics, the individual socio-emotional skills, we see that the contextual variable that is most correlated with individual functioning is family connectedness. So connected families are more associated with adolescents that have effective socio-emotional function. Is it bidirectional? Is it, again, very interesting. Moving on to South Sudan and the variable-centered analysis that I will show to you. Before I do that, I need to explain the concept of calculating a resilience statistic, which we do a lot in resilience studies in order to be able to do variable-centered analysis. Let's say that we have here a regression, yeah, where we have exposure to adversity as the predictor and level of adaptation as the outcome. Let's say that level of adaptation, for instance, it's mental health or it's peacefulness, yeah? And we expect that as adversity increases, on average, adaptation falls. Because obviously, adversity has a negative impact, yeah? So on average, you expect that the average mental health of people with extreme adversity will be lower than the average mental health of people with no adversity. But averages lie, correct? Because not everyone is on the average. And when it comes to resilience science, we actually care very much about the positive exceptions. Because the definition of resilience is thriving despite adversity. So if that's our definition of resilience, one way to develop a statistic for resilience is to look at to what extent someone is actually doing better than expected, statistically doing better than expected, given the adversity they experience. So if this person here, and the star here is the actual level of adaptation, the dotted line is the average level of adaptation. So if this person here is doing so well, despite having been subjected to violent conflict, divided family, poverty, etc., we define that distance from the actual level of adaptation to the expected level of adaptation as their resilience. Again, this is a strategy that has been used by many resilient scholars, starting from Marston and from Anne Marston and then several others. So what's interesting about this is that individuals with the same level of adaptation can be given different resilience scores based on how much they have to cope with. So this person and this person have the same adaptation, but this one is considered much more resilient. Yes. And this person and this person have the same adaptation, but this one is positively resilient, whereas this one is actually considered fragile, because based on the lack of adversity, you would have expected them to do much better. So, of course, this is statistically, this is nothing more than the residual. Yeah. This is the residual of the regression. So what we do is that we use the residual from the regression, for instance, of mental health on adversities, and we call that resilient mental health. The residual from the regression of peacefulness on adversity is called resilient peacefulness, and the residual of the food consumption variable is called resilient food consumption. I said this so that you can understand what will follow, because it's one thing to be looking at what predicts an outcome, and it's another thing to be looking at what predicts a resilient outcome after you have factored in the role of adversity. So in South Sudan, we looked at personal competencies, material assets, and community resources as sources of multidimensional resilience. And you see, what we did here is that we just correlated. We did actually partial correlation for reasons that I will explain in a moment. We correlated all of these personal competencies, such as executive skills, interpersonal tolerance, strength of South Sudanese identity, trust in outgroups, etc. We correlated them against resilient mental health, against resilient peacefulness, and resilient food consumption. We used partial correlation. So when we were testing for resilient mental health, we partialed out the effect of resilient peacefulness and resilient food consumption so that we have a clearer measure. We also corrected for multiple testing by raising the level of significance, so that by lowering the level of significance, so that we do not get too many false positives. What we found was that executive skills was a predictor of all three resiliences. We know, of course, that executive skills predict good mental health, but I think what this study is showing is that it predicts resilient mental health in adversity. Yes, we know that also, but it also predicts resilient peacefulness, even more than resilient mental health. So being able to organize your life, to have a plan, to control your impulses, all of that contributes to being a more peaceful person. And it also contributes to food consumption. It's logical, isn't it? Someone who has executive skills can manage their time to make enough money or to make a living. Yeah. So a very hardcore psychological concept like executive skills, we see how relevant it is for the other fields. We see, but of course, it's not by itself. So if you go down the whole column, what do you need for resilient peacefulness? You need executive skills, which is from, I would say, from mental health domain. You need interpersonal tolerance, which is more of a peace-building concept, inclusive civic identity and trust in outgroups, gender equality mindset, civic adherence and civic agency and civic dialogue. Yeah, so you need the psychological competencies, but you also need peace education, because most of these variables are within the peace education field. If we look at material assets, and again, this study was a very interesting experience for me as a psychologist, because as a psychologist, I'm not used to measuring things like structural quality of dwellings, whether people have hand tools, whether people have goats or chicken. But that's exactly what we measured in South Sudan, because it was an interdisciplinary study. And of course, we found that all of these assets predict resilient food consumption. There's no surprise there. If you have material assets, you do well, you can put food on the table. But what is surprising and interesting is the connection of some of these with mental health and peacefulness. So for instance, number of goats was associated with resilient mental health, even after correcting for partialing out the effects of the other resiliences, after correcting for multiple testing, etc. Food storage equipment predicted resilient mental health and also resilient peacefulness. Why? Well, because if you can store your food for times of drought, then you're going to be less, of course, you're going to be less hungry, obviously, but you're also going to be less anxious, because when there is floods, you will not say, oh my God, I'm going to go hungry tomorrow. You know you have stored food. You are also going to be less propensity for violence, because when the floods start, you're not going to think, I don't have enough food. I need to go and, I need to raid another village and steal their cows. You are less likely to think that because you have food. Yeah. So again, just like we saw executive skills, which is a psychological concept affecting livelihood, now we're seeing livelihood indicators such as food storage equipment affecting mental health. The importance of thinking in an interdisciplinary way. And finally, community capacities, community resources were measured through the multi-level process. So most of these were measured, actually, they were not measured at the individual level. It was a separate data set of community data that was superimposed on the individual data. And we saw, for instance, that economic cooperation within the community contributes to resilient peacefulness. The conflict resolution capacity of the chief contributes to resilient mental health. Healthcare contributes to mental health. Access to marketplaces contributes to mental health. Yes, again, we get the sense of multisystemic, of the importance of multisystemic recovery. Now, In the case of Rwanda, we did not do more of the same. We did something quite different there. Because there is already a lot of empirical research on population research on individual drivers of resilience, etc., we focused more on understanding the very rich landscape of existing systemic adaptations. And we used participatory action research methodology and to develop a grounded theory about adaptation, about multisystemic adaptation in Rwanda. We interviewed stakeholders and the beneficiaries of services in order to get an understanding of what services for recovery have been made available and what challenges still remain. And we found quite a lot that is happening. Actually, I must say that I have been very inspired by everything that I saw in Rwanda and how much they have recovered since the genocide. We saw the emergence of a sophisticated mental health sector. We saw sociotherapy as a methodology for community healing, reconciliation through collaborative livelihood initiatives, reintegration efforts for convicted genocide perpetrators, and even some nascent efforts to prevent intergenerational trauma. Though I should say that this is still very much in its infancy. We looked at the features of all this, and we also identified various challenges. For instance, we found that the sophisticated mental health sector that has developed over the last 20 years has been doing great work, but they are using a one-to-one therapy model that is not a good cultural fit for Rwanda. And it's also too expensive for a low-income country. We found that sociotherapy is really good at healing some trauma, moderate trauma, but is not suitable for persons with severe mental health disorders and does not address the family context. We found that existing collaborative livelihood initiatives are very helpful in promoting reconciliation, but they do not really provide sustainable livelihoods because they're not sufficiently professionalized. We found that the reintegration programs of genocide perpetrators are inspired, but they're not, and inspiring and multisystemic and multidimensional, but they're not the mainstream because they're done by NGOs and not by the government. And we found that efforts to prevent intergenerational trauma have simply not been systematically evaluated yet and are not adequately funded, and there is not enough emphasis on parenting practices. So you see, this approach allowed us to get a baseline, not just a baseline of where the population is, but also a baseline of where systems are. And then we can start developing interventions starting from this baseline instead of reinventing the wheel of solutions that are already taking place or even competing with existing solutions. So some insights from this section of the presentation. I think I will skip them because I think I spoke about them already during my presentation. So I think I can skip these two slides. And the final section of my presentation, developing innovative solutions for multisystemic resilience of conflict-affected societies. How can we develop public health infrastructures for multisystemic recovery and resilience based on these and other insights, and what should the main components be? Over the years, from conducting this research, we have come up with an overall theory of change for the recovery and resilience of such populations. And the theory of change goes as follows. Considering that violent conflict has triggered maladaptive system transitions across multiple levels, personal and collective traumas, we have seen this, family disruption, community polarization, failure of livelihood systems with multiple cross-level influences and cascades. So considering that this is the reality, we therefore require multisystemic strategies for recovery and resilience that will simultaneously tip each of the affected systems from a maladaptive to an adaptive regime. Yeah, I'm using now systems language and socio-ecological systems language, where we talk about regimes. Yes, and the regime is a stable situation. Don't think about political regimes. A regime is a stable situation in which a system is that cannot really be upset. You can put a lot of pressure on a regime, but unless you put enough force at multiple points of the regime, you cannot really transition it. Yes. So the challenge is, how do you transition from a maladaptive to an adaptive regime, transforming the cross-level influences cascade into virtuous cycles of change? So that's the main idea. That's what we need to achieve. We need multi-systemic efforts. And to achieve this, we require at the minimum intervention to promote psychological recovery, family connectedness, community cohesion and reconciliation, and collaborative recovery of livelihood systems. This is based on the evidence that we and others have been collecting on in Rwanda and in Ukraine and in South Sudan. We have been doing our reality checks. We've been looking at the work of other scholars to see if they are reaching similar conclusions. For instance, Panther Brick, for instance, from Yale, has also reached a similar conclusion based on her own empirical research in Afghanistan and various other countries about the importance of these specific dimensions. But these cannot be achieved in a vacuum. They require, because these interventions and changes require good governance, they require multi-stakeholder coordination, they require sustainable financing, they require training of practitioners, culture shifts, and more. Yeah? So that's why we need to start looking at this from a public health approach, because public health approaches do exactly this. They look at the whole population that faces multiple, complex, and interconnected needs, and they come up with a holistic strategy to address all those needs simultaneously. Yeah, but so we know what public health is. We know what recovery and resilience of conflict-affected population requires. But what we now need to do is that we need to use the public health approach for multisystemic recovery and resilience in conflict countries. This is something we have started to do in Rwanda. At the invitation of the government of Rwanda, about 3 years ago, we commenced research and development efforts for the development of a holistic, community-based, evidence-informed and scalable public health program for the psychosocial and socioeconomic recovery of survivors and perpetrators of the genocide against the Tutsi. And the partners include several government ministries, the Ministry of National Unity, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Local Development, international organizations and donors such as Interpeace, SEED, the European Union, the Swedish International Development Agency, academic institutions, our university here, the University of Rwanda, Victoria University, and McLean Hospital in Boston, and community-based organizations in Rwanda. The objective has been to develop protocols and approaches that are group-based, resilience-oriented, and informed by global best practices while being culturally grounded in Rwanda. And after about 2 years of work, using multi-stakeholder methodologies and collaborative design, we have come up with a toolkit for multisystemic assessment and intervention that includes several elements. The slide is there if anyone wants to ask me about it afterwards in detail, or if the committee wants to ask me about it. I won't go over it in a lot of detail, but I will highlight a few of these interventions. So we developed new protocols where we found that there were gaps. So for instance, you see, we still have the sociotherapy, which is an established intervention in Rwanda. So since it's already working and there is evidence and publication supporting it, there's no need to put aside something that is successful. So the project has been financing additional sociotherapy services, but we also developed novel psychosocial interventions, such as resilience-oriented group therapy, which is intended to strengthen the skills and resilience for people that meet clinical disorder criteria, which is what sociotherapy cannot do. Multifamily healing spaces, which are guidelines for bringing together groups of families to address issues related to intergenerational trauma. A socio-emotional skills curriculum, a manual for community-based enterprises that aims to professionalize the way collaborative livelihood initiatives are done. And then also screening and assessment protocols so that people can be allocated to the correct appropriate interventions. A screening protocol for communities and a protocol for prisoner risk and resilience assessment that can guide their rehabilitation and reintegration. So you can imagine that this was quite a lot of work. A lot of people have been involved. I think the design team was we were more than 20 people in the design team. More than 100 professionals have been trained. So we're talking about, and then those have trained others. So we're talking about quite a large-scale program. And just to give you some examples from this intervention, from the protocols in Rwanda, what we tried to do is a lot of it was based, a lot of the psychosocial interventions was based on cognitive behavioral approaches, which we culturally adapted for the context of Rwanda. We were supported by McLean Hospital in Boston that gave us access to some of their own protocols. And we used those to inform adaptations for the cultural context. This is an example of a cultural adaptation of an exercise for exposure to triggers. Let me walk you through it. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes. Take a deep breath and exhale slowly while you are hearing a story. Imagine that you're walking in the mountains near the volcanoes. You can hear the animals, the birds singing, and the wind blowing through the leaves. You can smell the rain. There is a musky, fresh, earthly scent in the air. Take a minute or two to stop and look around you. You can see all different kinds of animals passing by and the birds flying from tree to tree. You can see a gorilla at a distance. Take a deep breath and exhale slowly. The gorilla cannot harm you. Look closely at the gorilla. Observe his features. Look at how small his eyes are and how hairless his face is. Look at his fur, how long and thick it is. Slowly try to approach the gorilla. Walk towards him and keep observing him as you do. He does not seem that dangerous after all. Slowly raise your hand as you try to touch his soft fur. The gorilla is your triggers. Observe your triggers closely, what they look like, and try to better understand them. When you are ready, try to approach them, knowing they cannot harm you, only the way you respond to them will. When you are ready, open your eyes. This is one out of many such exercises. You see, there are gorillas in Rwanda, there are volcanoes, it rains a lot, that sense of the musky rain. It's something that culturally resonates quite a lot. Yeah? So that's the kind of work that we try to do. And it was a collaborative exercise between our lab, the PhD students in our lab that did a lot of the heavy lifting, and the postdocs that did a lot of the heavy lifting for all this, and also practitioners in Rwanda that were giving us feedback on the material that we were producing. The socio-emotional skills curriculum that I have mentioned, we ended up including skills for emotional well-being, collaboration, and self-management. It has a lot of elements of what you would expect from a standard socio-emotional curriculum that is done for mental health purposes, but it also includes a lot of skills that are more closely related to peace education and peace building, such as cultivating gratitude and kindness, cultivating respect, cultivating forgiveness, cultivating remorse. These are the kind of things that we tend to kind of not think about so much in mental health, but are very important in peace building. In resilience-oriented group therapy, we basically packaged a lot of these socio-emotional skills into a clinical group intervention. We called it resilience-oriented so that it is less stigmatizing, but it's basically a clinical intervention. And it starts as a very classical psychological intervention with psychoeducation and then skills training. But as those skills are acquired, the participants are encouraged to start using those skills to improve their relationships, to improve their civic participation, to more generally improve the role they play in the community. So it starts clinical and gradually becomes more social. This intervention has been customized also based on clinical profile. So the clinical profiles were identified through the population research in Rwanda. We found an anxious depressive profile for which we adapted resilience-oriented therapy for emotion regulation. We found a substance abusing profile, so we adapted it for behavioral self-management. And we found what we called an alienation emptiness profile. One could say borderline, but they don't use that word in Rwanda, so we also avoid using it. And we call that resilience-oriented therapy for identity development. And each variant of the therapy has a slightly different set of skills that are cultivated. Multifamily healing spaces was what was innovative about multifamily healing is that it involves the whole family and multiple families in a community in a process that is not just about improving family relationships, as we often do in family therapy, but also about finding better ways to discuss the history of the conflict in ways that do not traumatize the next generation and do not propagate trauma into the next generation. This is the first group of graduates of multifamily healing spaces. The first group graduated a few months ago. We have some qualitative, we haven't, as I will mention in a moment, the randomized trials are now commencing, but we do have some qualitative insights from the first group of graduates. And one report that struck me was a father saying that before I joined the multifamily healing spaces, I wouldn't, after work, I would just go out with my friends. I wouldn't talk to my family. I had a really bad relationship with my children. I was also ashamed to talk to them about because of my role in the genocide. But now I realized that I actually want to spend more time with my family. Now I cook for them every day. Now my children come to me and play with me. And I find that I can talk about history and be honest with my children and that they actually appreciate that honesty. Yeah. So that's just a vignette of transformation. But we're now collecting, of course, the evidence to see that this really works for everyone. And of course, in order to, a challenge, of course, is deciding what intervention everyone should receive. So we have come up with a community, with an algorithm to allocate participants to interventions based on how they score on different indicators. So for instance, individuals who score high on community polarization, but don't have mental health problems, go to sociotherapy. Individuals that have high depression and anxiety go to resilience therapy. Individuals that we find primarily have family dysfunction go to multifamily healing spaces. Next steps in the Rwanda program, randomized control trials. These are currently underway for resilience-oriented therapy and multifamily healing spaces, and more will follow for some of the other protocols. Digitization and integration of socio-emotional skills training program so that it can be used in Rwandan schools. And of course, writing about the intervention protocols and the results of the randomized trials in peer-reviewed journals. There's a lot of writing to be done. Future directions more generally about this line of research. There's a lot of room to develop novel research methods for the assessment of multisystemic resilience in conflict-affected societies. And some of these methods I have, my students and I have actually been working to develop some of these methods here in the local context of Cyprus, with a view to eventually utilizing in this research program. So for instance, ecological momentary assessment is a method that we are now using in 2 PhD theses, and we will eventually transport to conflict-affected countries so that we can better assess family functioning. Agent-based modeling is something that we are now using in a dissertation to investigate prison suicide and preventing prison suicide, but eventually we will use it to understand community resilience. Situational judgment tests have a lot of promise, especially for assessing socio-emotional skills in a more creating more naturalistic challenges that people can respond to. And participatory assessments can also play a very important role in governing the implementation of such initiatives. Refining another future direction is refinement of intervention protocols. This is still very much the beginning. I mean, we have now a resilience-oriented group therapy. I'm sure 5 years from now will be look very different from now than it does now. And we also need additional components such as for couples resilience, community leadership. Improve strategies for bringing such programs to national scale. For instance, sustainable financing, integration with higher education systems, governance reforms, and finally, development of a community of practice focusing on multisystemic resilience of conflict-affected populations. Of course, all of this is done in the context of trying to balance various other responsibilities. As an academic, supervising students, what I try to do with students is encourage them to incorporate a resilience lens in whatever they wish to study, because resilience is not a field, it's not so much a topic of study, but a way of looking at research. So for instance, we have one student that is finishing a PhD thesis on resilience in an elite football context. And there has been a lot of other engagement at the university and in the community where I've been trying to see things from this multisystemic resilience lens, which can help with a lot of problems. So thank you very much for your attention, and apologies that I went a little bit over. A lot of people that I want to thank, but I won't mention them by name because everyone is written. Everyone that I felt I really should thank is mentioned here. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to those that I have not mentioned. And thank you for your attention. I am ready to take your questions and feedback. Feel free to be critical, because critical feedback is normally often the most useful.
Thank you, Alexandros. I think for the sake of time, we can take maybe 2 questions from the audience, maybe one from the people present outside the committee, and if somebody wants to write something in the chat from the online audience, we can take that question as well. So, anybody in the room? Have something? Go ahead.
Yes, Michael.
Thank you. The decision of why those.
It's a very good question. Yeah. I will repeat the question for the audience. Yes. So yes. So the question was, how do we decide which variables to include in the models? Why these variables and not others? That's a very good question. And it's something that I haven't mentioned in my presentation. Before every study, especially you're referring to the population research, before every study, there is an extensive, what we have come to call calibration process. And that calibration process usually involves an extensive in-country mission, usually several weeks. We have done this for all of the countries in some of these countries, several such missions, speaking with stakeholders in order to get from them an initial sense of, we do a variable mapping with the stakeholders. We try to elicit from the stakeholders their own qualitative sense of what is happening in their own country. A country's population is usually their own best expert in some of these things. And at the same time, we look at the academic literature. So we try to combine the academic sources for the problem as a whole. For instance, food security. There is a whole literature on food security, and thousands of articles have been written about it. So we look at the literature, we talk to the stakeholders, we come up with an outline of suggested questions and indicators to include. We vet that with the stakeholders. So the research process itself is quite participatory, even for the quantitative research.
But there's also theory behind.
Yes, there is each of the components has its own theory. Yes, so the mental health components there are relevant theories of mental health that we are considering. The peace building components has its own theories. Yes. There is a question from the chat. How would a similar process informed by multisystemic resilience look like in another conflict-affected country, which has a very different set of challenges, namely Cyprus? The Cyprus problem. So I've done a lot of Cyprus problem work in earlier years. I have done much less in the last several years. I have found it has helped me to be more objective as a scholar by focusing on other countries rather than Cyprus. Though I definitely understand and respect the question, and it is very important. I think I will answer in principle about other countries rather than not so sure if what I can say about Cyprus. But in principle, over the past year, we have been working with Interpeace, which is an international organization that has also been our partner in Rwanda, to develop a guidance framework for practitioners who wish to practice multisystemic approaches in conflict-affected societies. And we have come up with a manual. It's actually publicly available. It's titled Mind the Peace, and it provides guidance for those who would like to start this process of developing a strategy for multisystemic recovery in their own country. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all. An important starting point is to get practitioners from different disciplines together in the same room, mental health experts, peace builders, livelihood experts, and others, and get a sense of challenges, start getting a sense of how these might be linked at the different levels, and then take it from there to either adapt or develop the appropriate protocols. In the case of Cyprus, I think there's a lot of intergenerational trauma linked to the events of the 1960s and 1970s that is not really acknowledged or addressed. I think it is affecting. What is happening. We have a master's student now, actually, who is looking at that trauma in families of the missing, and it's actually on my to-do list to actually read her findings, which she just got last week. So I think there's a lot of room to do this work in Cyprus, and I hope somebody takes it up. I don't think it will be me necessarily. There's another. Okay. So since you think of novel research methods, do you consider using latent variables instead of single variables? Exploring correlations between individual variables can help identify initial relationships, but it has limitations. Latent variable modeling can provide a more comprehensive understanding of the underlying constructs. I agree. I agree that it's better to be using latent variable modeling than observed variables, and sometimes I think it's a better practice, and I think it's a better practice. The results are usually not very different, but there is an edge of precision when you use latent variable modeling than when you construct observed variables, and sometimes we have done it. I think it also depends on who the audience is. It depends on how much time is available. It depends. Sometimes when we do work for practitioners, sometimes we work in emergencies, and we do work for practitioners rather than for a scholarly audience. And when there is a trade-off between time and emergency of providing the results so that they can be fit into another policy process, we weigh that against the precision issues and come up with a decision that is appropriate for that specific analysis. Is there? We have a greeting from our colleagues in Ukraine. We have a greeting from our colleague in Ukraine, Katerina, and I wish to recognize our colleagues from Ukraine that have been part of this research process and that are now displaying. We are talking here about resilience, but resilience is what they live every day, and I want to send my love and appreciation to them. Is there anything else? I think though we need to stop, right?
I think we need to close. So I want to thank the online audience and excuse them, and also the audience in the room who are not part of the committee, so that the committee can proceed with the formal procedures. So thank you all for being here.
For those of you who are physically here, there are some snacks outside. For those who are virtually here, I can do nothing more for you.
Thank you, everyone.